Hey everyone, it's Scott Rustrolz here with the May 30th edition of the Listen N Learn Podcast. Hope you all had a happy, long weekend and spent some time this Memorial Day to think about the million Americans who've sacrificed their lives to ensure that we could live in a free and wonderful country like we do. With that, a couple stories I want to get to today. The first and the biggest one really is just kind of follows on from President Trump's trip to Europe last week, where really the big thing was, and was something we highlighted, was Trump proactively telling Europe they need to start spending more money on NATO. In response, you had German Chancellor Angela Merkel come out and say, quote, Germany can't completely depend on the United States. And we'll need to think about finding a way to be self-sustainable. And this got a massive hoopla in the media of the massive breakdown of the transatlantic partnership. But in reality, what she said is exactly what Trump has been pushing for and exactly what is needed. Countries cannot completely depend on other countries. That's not the point of NATO. NATO, again, is a joint security pact. That means that each country is able to provide some securities to the other. And the mechanism by which that is done is NATO's requirement that you spend 2% of GDP on defense. And that is where Europe has completely fallen down, as shown by this chart. If you look, you'll notice that almost no European countries is meeting the 2% requirement. Germany only spends 1.2%. France is 1.8%. Spain is 0.9%. Italy is 1.1%. And essentially, Europe has allowed their military might to atrophy and are unable to provide joint security in a meaningful way. Instead, they are free riding on the United States, which spends about 3.5% of GDP on defense. And NATO has turned into this American defense blanket. That's not the point of the organization. That's not why it was created. This was joint security between the United States and Europe. And you have a country as rich as Germany, there's no reason why they should not be spending 2% on defense. Over the weekend, French President Macron met with Russian President Vladimir Putin and rightly to his face called him out for a lot of the propaganda machine of RT and Sputnik, and he was getting applauded for this tough talk. But I'm left asking, how is Macron going to back up the tough talk? Because it's one thing to talk, it's another to have the capacity to act. And the answer is, with the amount of defense spending in Europe, there's no way they can stand up to Russia. Instead, they need to turn back, look to us in the West and say, help us counter this threat. So maybe Macron should go further than tough talk and actually do some action and start spending on defense. And Germany needs to be able to meet its commitments. If there's any country in Europe that can afford 2% of defense, it's Germany. And then you have this very interesting poll out of the Pew Research Center today that shows that Germany, of all NATO countries, is the one that's least willing to help defend another NATO ally should Russia attack them. So for all this tough talk on Merkel saying whether or not she can completely depend on us, it's the German public that appears to be the least dependable of anyone inside of Russia. Or anyone inside of NATO, excuse me. And this is a serious problem. I'm glad Trump is beginning talking tough with NATO, but we need to go from tough talk to actually getting deliverables and getting them to spend more on defense. So, part of our strategy is getting Europe to say, you know what, they can't just rely on America to be a stooge, to paying for all of their defenses while they overspend on entitlements. Germany uses the weak euro to steal everyone else's manufacturing bases. We need some burden sharing here. And Trump laid a marker in the ground, but there's more work to be done. With that, I want to go to a second story, which is kind of step back, bigger issue thing. And that's this whole continued discussion following Trump's debate on whether or not the United States can grow 3% in the future. You have outlets like Politico saying it's an impossibility. 3% is gone. And that's where I think we need to take a step back. And let me explain to you how you should push back on this argument that the U.S. can't grow 3%. Well, and that takes me to this graph here, and we'll explain in a minute comparing us to Russia, actually, which is not should not be the most difficult comparison in the world. Well, a core argument for why the U.S. can't grow 3% is that we don't have enough population growth. Well, if you look at Russia from 1928 to 2015, they had population growth of 0.25%, that small blue bar. And their cumulative growth was 2.63% because they generated productivity gains of about 2.4%. Now this again is under the Soviet Union the majority of the time, which I don't think anyone would argue was really a bastion of productivity. Now, the U.S. pessimists that are saying we're only growing 2%, they expect us to grow 0.7% in population. That's the widely held consensus. So they're basically saying that our productivity potential is half of that of the old Soviet Union. And you really have to say, do you really think the next generation of Americans can't be as innovative and productive as Soviet and post-Soviet Russia? That's a breathtakingly pessimistic view that I can't subscribe to. If instead you take the realist route, which again has the same 0.7% population growth, and says, you know what, we can generate the same productivity gains as the Soviet Union did. Suddenly, you're at 3.1% growth, right on target for essentially the Trump's 3% growth. So as the chart of the title of the chart says, if the U.S. is productive, as Russia has been, we'll grow 3%. And I don't think anyone would argue the Soviet Union had an optimal economic policy. I'd like to think the U.S. could do at least as well as Russia's done the past 100 years. After all, Russia's still not even a fully developed country, So the next time someone says low population growth precludes us from getting to 3% growth, point them to this, that, hey, Russia hit 2.6% with 0.2% population growth. You give us the extra 45 basis points of population growth that is the widely held consensus. Suddenly we're over 3%. And so a target that much of the mainstream media is saying is impossible suddenly looks quite attainable. I want to wrap up with two smaller stories tonight. First one is the travel ban, the laptop ban that we've talked about in the past. There were some reports today that we're now not going to implement the laptop ban. That's been batted back by DHS, saying that we're working with our European partners who are viscerally against the laptop ban and trying to see if there's ways we can improve security so that one's not necessary. This has been dragging out for a couple weeks, which I think speaks to the fact that the Europeans have been fighting at it so hard. But given as we saw the Manchester attack today, an asylum seeker in Germany was arrested for planning a terrorist attack. Europe does not quite have a handle on who it's in its country as a result of Angela Merkel's open migrant policies. And at the end of the day, if we're not comfortable with our security, DHS should not hesitate to ban laptops on planes. But I think this is still not resolved. I will continue to keep you posted as there's any developments. And finally, in today's bizarro story and disgusting story of the day, we have Kathy Griffin. She posted this picture today of her and a beheaded President Donald Trump. It's just disgusting. And you just have to ask, how crass has our civil discourse become that anyone would think this is acceptable? You can't help but imagine what the outrage would be if a Republican had done this to President Obama, and the outrage then would have been justified. And I want to begin by applauding Chelsea Clinton, Jake Tapper, and others who came out immediately and said this kind of imagery is unacceptable. And I would just call on both sides to say we need to elevate the level of discussion in our country, recognize that those who are our political opponents are not our enemies, and say we're going to have a debate on issues. We're not going to threaten violence. It's not funny. I don't know if it was intended to be funny. It's not art. It's not humorous. It's disgusting. It's crass. It belittles the office of the presidency. It belittles yourself. Particularly in a time where you see people shutting down speech on college campuses, you've seen violence on college campuses, we need to step back the rhetoric on both sides of the aisle and say, let's engage on the issues in a respectful way and get this out of our political culture. We're better than this as a country. So those are the 4 stories highlighting today. Again, thank you as always for listening. If you enjoy the podcast, I implore you to subscribe to our videos. That way you can be alerted every time they come. Also, feel free, we'd be honored if you'd share these videos with your friends if you think they too would be interested in them. You can also follow us on Twitter @ReadAndLearn and follow us on Facebook, the Listen and Learn Podcast. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night.